Hi, so the article that I will be discussing in my video is Ann Tickner's What is Your Research Program? Some Feminist Answers to International Relations Methodological Questions. So in this article, Tickner discusses the division between IR feminists and IR theorists. So IR feminists rely on a completely different way of asking and answering questions in their research, but some IR theorists believe that IR feminists should follow a specific methodology that is assumed to be more objective than the way IR feminist research is conducted now. So the article offers two specific examples about the methodology that IR feminists use through two studies. One of these is Sex Among Allies, and that's the one I'll be focusing on towards the end of the video. So one of the main theorists that Tickner disagrees with is Robert Keohane, who we discussed in Module 4. In his work, he suggests the best way for IR feminists to get their point across to non-believers is by following neo-positive IR methodology. He says that researchers must be as objective as possible. Tickner also calls his theories feminist empiricism, which is basically the argument that sexism and androcentrism, which is basically putting a male viewpoint at the center of your research or center of your world, are biases that can be fixed by closely following methodologies in research. So IR feminists follow 4 guidelines when doing research. 1, the research questions asked are incredibly important. They're not only asking questions, but they're asking why they're asking those questions. 2, designing less socially biased universal research that's helpful for both women and men internationally. 3, reflexivity and subjectiveness of the researcher, and 4, knowledge as emancipation. So some of these points apply to all IR research in general, but IR feminists are unique because the research is done with a focus on a female perspective and viewpoint. So this makes sense because feminism at its core places value in female lives, as all fields should, in my opinion. But throughout history, women's lives have been continuously ignored, gone unnoticed, or looked at through a male-focused lens. So for example, historically, the beginning of humankind is known and studied as the beginning of man in science. Women as hunter-gatherers, shelter makers, producers, reproducers are almost entirely ignored, while men building society from bottom up is emphasized. So one question that Tickner poses from this that I found really interesting is how useful social science research really is if it's completely biased at its core and solely focuses on the development and communication between males throughout history, when females are a vital part of history and literally the creation of the world. So for example, Keohane argues that research should be completely detached from their work in order to keep it from being biased, which I think leads to less objectivity. IR feminists focus more on the reflexive relationship they have with their research and aim to keep a dialogue between their study. So going back to the lecture in Module 4, reflexivity is the way that researchers affect the data they collect and react with the data they collect. So for example, a female IR researcher might be more welcomed and receive less guarded answers from women in a shelter for domestic abuse victims, while a man going in and doing research might receive more guarded answers or no answers at all. So obviously this affects the outcome of studies and can be used to one's advantage as an IR feminist, as a female. One thing to not misunderstand, though, after reading this article is that IR feminists don't just ignore quantitative data. They've just found that the data collected is misused and completely gender biased and doesn't really tell the actual true stories of women and other marginalized groups around the entire world. So IR feminists have used sociological analysis in order to fix this, to change the structure of states that women live in when they live in unequal power balances, while traditional IR theory just explains why things are this way, but the IR feminists strive to change it. So personally, I think that focusing on marginalized groups leads to more objectivity because it focuses on groups that wouldn't otherwise be studied through traditional IR methods. So for example, a study by Marilyn Waring shows that national income data in Zimbabwe completely ignored reproduction and household caring acts. So women who work in homes as caretakers and housekeepers are considered economically inactive when that's not the story at all. So that means that laws and regulations made in the country won't be made with their work in mind, even though they're citizens, which I find just completely mind-blowing. So many IR feminists will use the stories of the women they study, like the women in this study, as forms of empowerment, because the research does strive to make a change in the lives of women through empowerment, and research can be a part of that. So conventional social science IR research tends to stay detached from subjects and politics as well. I don't think it's possible really to stay detached from most social science research if you want to get like a representative research or representative sample of an entire population, not just a privileged group that continuously goes noticed. So for example, Tickner talks about the study in sex among allies, which I think is really important to understanding the methodology behind IR feminist research. So the Woman Moon studies IR prostitution camps around U.S. military bases in the Republic of Korea. And her analysis completely led her to rethink the meaning of national security. Basically what happened is the Korean government cleaned up the area for American troops without having their own citizens who were sex workers in the area in mind. So the Korean government took into account the U.S. military's environment and safety, but not the vulnerable people that it was meant to serve. But on the flip side, some women saw it as a way of empowerment because it empowered them to find a different line of work because they could no longer make income there. And it also protected them from abuse by U.S. soldiers. So with these two different results, one really important part of Moon's work is the explanation of the women she studied and spoke to. So she gave them a voice that they hadn't had before, as they were an ignored group of society that wasn't researched in many studies. So I agree with IR feminist methodology because it gives a voice to the marginalized groups of people who can't often be counted out due to their marginalization. So most of the time, these are the people who need the laws and regulations and help of the government and social programs the most, but they're continually ignored and marginalized due to traditional IR methodologies. So going off of this, one thing that Tickner argues that's really interesting but also unfortunate is that quantitative research methods are instruments for structuring reality in certain ways. So objectivity in traditional IR theory can serve as a way to give truth to things that aren't representative of an entire population. So this is really unfair and untrue and definitely represents data incorrectly. So it brings up the question of why should we accept IR theory, like traditional methods, more than IR feminist theory research methods are accepted if those methods aren't even accurate or unbiased. So in conclusion, I definitely side more with Tickner's viewpoints as marginalized groups will continue to be misrepresented and under-researched and understudied if IR research continues to stay with traditional IR research methods. Yeah.